Stephen Chow first appeared on my radar with the release of Shaolin Soccer in 2001, which was his first kind of international success. And it had a limited theatrical run in Britain, so I saw it in the cinema. And it struck me as a very fresh approach to martial arts cinema, incorporating CGI in what seemed to be a kind of innovative way, merging it with football, which seemed an unlikely topic for a CGI martial arts extravaganza. And just the irreverent comedy, the special effects, Chow's winning persona, you know, the combination was something I hadn't seen before. So I followed his career thereafter.
我提老祖，今日你唔將唐三藏交出嚟，死路一條！你同我講咁多做咩？你問託世孫悟空啊嘛？喂，結拜細佬孫悟空喺邊度啊？
Stephen Chow gained a foothold in the entertainment industry by beginning as an apprentice actor for the local television outfit TVB, which is a kind of breeding ground for many Hong Kong movie stars. And he was contracted to host a children's television show called 4:30 Space Shuttle. And he stayed on that show for 4 years and was a very popular figure among the youth audience. And he kind of parlayed that popularity into an acting career in movies. Around 1986, people say that he actually has a very small kind of blink and you'll miss him role in A Better Tomorrow, John Woo's kind of breakout film in 1986. He worked pretty regularly through the mid to late 80s in movies. He gained some attention in certain roles, so he won a prestigious prize at the Golden Horse Awards, which is Taiwan's Oscars, for a supporting role in a film called Final Justice. And then his breakout film was in 1990s, All for the Winner, which was directed by Jeff Lau, who would direct a number of Chow films through the 90s, including the Chinese Odyssey films, and would eventually produce Kung Fu Hustle as well. So that was a film that really made Chow an A-list movie star, a box office champion from there on in. I mean, from the 90s, it was a remarkable run of movies. Hit after hit, really, commercial hits. And so he made some films in that period that even today, you know, film goers, film critics regard as among the finest Hong Kong films made in that period and among the finest Hong Kong comedies ever made. So, you know, there were the Royal Tramp films, there was the Fight Back to School series, Hail the Judge, Flirting Scholar, and then there were the films he directed, because he begins directing around 1994. And From Beijing with Love was his directorial debut, which is a kind of 007 spoof. Forbidden City Cop, God of Cookery, King of Comedy. I mean, these are all sort of seminal films that he directs in the mid to late 90s. So he had a very hot hand through the 90s. And All for the Winner, that film directed by Jeff Lau, was the film that really got his career on track. Final Justice is an atypical performance and character for Chow because it's not a comedy and he gives a serious dramatic performance. And in the same period, in 1989, he made another film called Just Heroes. And this is a film co-directed by John Woo. And it's a kind of tribute film to Chang Cheh, the great Shaw Brothers film director, who is kind of John Woo's mentor. It includes a cast of Shaw Brothers veterans like David Chang and Di Long. And Stephen Chow is in this film, and it's not a comedy, it's a heroic bloodshed film of the type that John Woo was making in that period. And it's surprising how well Stephen Chow assimilates to that universe of gunplay and heroic bloodshed and, you know, serious grave themes of loyalty and betrayal and brotherhood and so on. So it gives a glimpse, those two films, I think, Final Justice and Just Heroes, give a glimpse of a kind of alternative shadow career, like a sliding doors moment. The kind of dramatic career that Stephen Chow could have had he pursued more, you know, serious terrain, instead of specialising exclusively in comedy, which is what he would go on to do. But having said that, I think that there are moments, even in his comedies, he carves out moments in his comedies for serious dramatic expression. He'll undercut those moments with a gag ultimately, but he gives himself an outlet to show off his more dramatically emotional and poignant side. But yeah, it's intriguing to think the kind of career he might have had as a director and an actor had he pursued more dramatic roles. We might be talking about him in the same breath as Tony Leung Chi-wai or Anthony Wong as one of the great Hong Kong dramatic actors. The common wisdom in the 1990s was that Stephen Chow was one of the few Hong Kong directors whose films were impossible to export because they relied on so-called mo lei tao humour, which is Cantonese wordplay. So the jokes depended on an intimate knowledge of the Cantonese dialect because the jokes would be founded on, slang, colloquialisms, innuendos, double entendres, non sequiturs, all various manipulations of the Cantonese dialect that were ultimately nonsensical, but that would not translate well into other languages and into English subtitles. So the films were very difficult. It was assumed that the films would not travel well across borders, and that his audience was destined to be that of the loyal Hong Kong audience and the Cantonese-speaking diaspora dotted around the globe. But there's a tension there because he had ambitions to expand his audience on a global scale, and he talks about this in interviews in the 1990s, that he wanted his films to reach a wider audience beyond Hong Kong. And so what happens, I think, is starting really with Shaolin Soccer, he starts to strategically kind of minimize the use of mo lei tao, Cantonese-based dialogue. He purges his films largely, if not wholly, of some of their other more unpalatable features that might be considered alienating for Western viewers. Gay jokes, homosexual humour, scatological humour, that kind of thing, and plays up instead sight gags, so visual jokes that are easily comprehensible across cultures. And obviously the incorporation of CGI technology helps to sort of upholster those gags as well. And that proves a remarkably successful strategy because Shaolin Soccer is a global hit. He carries on in the same vein with Kung Fu Hustle a couple of years later, which is an even bigger success on the global stage. And CJ7 and so on. But yeah, I think it's true that some of the films from the 90s, although they have been released on, say, DVD, Blu-ray, sometimes the subtitles don't capture the nuances of the dialogue, and certain jokes will be missed, I'm sure, by audiences that are not proficient in Cantonese.
大家唔好嬲啦，咁會犯咗真戒㗎。唉，悟空，你真係曳曳啦！我叫咗你唔好亂咁掟嘢㗎啦，你咁樣亂咁掟嘢係唔啱啊！嗱，我考未完就掟咗支棍啦，月光寶盒係寶物嚟㗎嘛，你咁。
In 1994, Chow founded his own production company called Choi Sing Film Productions, and it put out just 2 films, and those were the Chinese Odyssey films. So technically one film if you consider them as 2 parts of one movie. And because the films were such failures at the box office, surprisingly from today's perspective, but they were, he closed the doors on that production house. The films were not well received critically in Hong Kong. The critics generally felt that the films were not faithful to the source novel because the films are based on a classical Chinese novel called Journey to the West, but very loosely based on that source text. And critics were upset that the film was not strictly faithful to the story. Commercially, the films were unsuccessful in Hong Kong and in mainland China because the films were co-productions between mainland Chinese and Hong Kong studios. Within a short few years, though, Chinese Odyssey developed a kind of cult following in mainland China. So by the late 90s, it had a pretty large cult fandom that was comprised chiefly of young people, the youth audience, people in their teens and early 20s. Some people say it was the VCD market, that these films were available on video compact disc, which is a kind of cheap version of a DVD, but cheap to purchase, as well as sort of cheap transfers. So, you know, the films could be passed around among school friends, classmates on VCD. Some say the rise of the internet played a part, that there were web pages produced by fans, you know, expressly devoted to these films. Others say that there's a kind of anti-authoritarian streak within the films themselves, or that can be read into the films, that the ideology is kind of anti-elitist, anti-authoritarian, that appeals to a young audience that is pretty much familiar with sort of mainland Chinese propaganda movies. And then others say that the films were belatedly successful because they were offering something, a kind of an original take on this very well-known source text, Journey to the West, which, you know, most students in China would have read at school. That Stephen Chow's film, Jeffrey Lau's films, departed in an inventive way, an innovative way, on that basic source material.
哦，你中意啊？
哇！我唔係你師兄啊，知道
我同你叫我不大。叫咗你唔好玩火㗎啦！阿彌陀佛，拜拜。
The films were co-produced by mainland China and Hong Kong, and the co-productions were not unprecedented in the 90s, but they were not prevalent. They are today. So today, you know, more than half of Hong Kong cinema's annual output is a co-production with mainland China. There are a few dotted around throughout the 90s. Once Upon a Time in China, Choi Hark's, you know, martial arts extravaganza is a co-production. But back then, the balance wasn't strictly 50-50. So the assumption was, and it's a reasonable belief, was that the sort of creative talent resided in Hong Kong. And so if you look at the credits for these movies, you'll see that, you know, the cast, the director, the writer, who is Jeffrey Lau using a pseudonym, the cinematographers, you know, the editor, the creative personnel from the Hong Kong film industry. And what mainland China could provide was the finance and the exotic locations, right? These sort of natural, vast desert landscapes that are just not to be found in Hong Kong, certainly not on that sort of scale. So it was not a strictly 50-50 split in terms of the partnership. The films were produced according to the local custom of film practice in that period. So in that period, in the 1990s, Hong Kong films were not launched on the basis of a screenplay, of a pre-production screenplay. So so there would be no script. Instead of a full-fledged screenplay, there would just be a plot synopsis. And that was usually a pretty skimpy document, so it would consist of 1 or 2 pages. And it would not contain dialogue. It would not contain scene-by-scene breakdowns. It would just outline the broad contours of the story. And then even that was not ironclad. You know, that was subject to change during the shooting. And the story would be improvised by the director and the actors on set or on location during the shooting on a day-by-day basis. So the writers, the director might stay up the night before, write out a broad scene, a sketchy scene, give it to the actors the next morning to shoot that morning. And the story was built on that basis. So it's a very spontaneous, improvisatory way of working, very different from Hollywood, of course. And the Chinese Odyssey films were made according to that method. And also at that period, films were mostly shot silent. So they would not employ synchronized sound recording, which meant that they could work faster because they didn't have to worry about miking the actors and setting up the boom mics and checking the sound levels. They could just worry about the visual image and the performances. And they could deal with the soundtrack later on in post-production editing. And they would lay in the entire soundtrack in post-production, so dialogue and sound effects, everything. And that meant that the dialogue and also plot points could be figured out quite late into post-production, you know, when the looping took place. So again, it gives the films a certain energy, I think, and a certain unpredictability at the level of plotting, because everything hasn't been masterminded in advance. It's kind of done on the fly, but in a very creative and I think vibrant way, you know, in a vibrant atmosphere. I think the films offer audiences what many viewers of the time would have come to expect from a Stephen Chow comedy. You see it in the cast. So there is the presence of Ng Man Tat, who is a kind of mainstay of Hong Kong cinema at that period, but also really Stephen Chow's comedy partner. He appears in many films with Chow through the 90s. They would ultimately part ways, but he's a fixture of Stephen Chow's 90s comedies. And Karen Mok as well, who was Stephen Chow's paramour at the time and regular co-star. There are other things, the use of kind of gender confusion, again the gay jokes, the cross-dressing, I would say the sort of melodramatic use of film style as well, that's unnecessarily melodramatic, you know, which is a source of humour, where the use of stylistic techniques becomes over-determined in a way that doesn't match the action that it's accompanying. So you get these sharp zoom shots, zooms in and out of characters' reactions in, I think, part 1, Pandora's Box, that are disproportionate to the action that's being depicted, you know. So style itself becomes comedic because it takes on a sort of melodramatic quality that's unwarranted, you know. And then I would say the inclusion of intertextual references, so references to other movies, and this is a kind of hallmark of Stephen Chow's comedies. I think of him as the cinephile's comedian, you know, because if you love movies, you'll probably love Stephen Chow's comedies because there are references to movies all the way through them. He usually, you know, his favourite targets are the major filmmakers like Steven Spielberg and John Woo and Wong Kar-wai. So he's punching up. These are affectionate, you know, parodies, if you like, of these filmmakers' work. They're not derogatory or anything like that. They're affectionate send-ups, I think. And it is virtually every Stephen Chow film includes an allusion to Bruce Lee. Some of the films are large-scale homages to Bruce Lee. And so this kind of reference to other movies, these sort of allusions, are very much in evidence in the Chinese Odyssey films, particularly Part 2, where there are several references to Wong Kar-wai's work. So when Stephen Chow is talking about the distance and the length of a bladed weapon, it's a kind of riff on Takeshi Kanashiro's opening monologue in Chungking Express. And there are quotations from Ashes of Time, Wong Kar-wai's 1994 wuxia epic, and he even borrows some of the music score from that film and some of the costuming too. So there's one moment where the Stephen Chow character is dressed and made up to look very much like Tony Leung Chi-wai's blind swordsman in Ashes of Time. So very much the hallmarks, the features of Stephen Chow comedy are in play in this pair of movies. One of the things that's impressive about these films is the production values, the special effects, particularly the practical effects. So in terms of the prosthetics, you know, the pyrotechnics, the wire work and so on, I think this is a feat of special effects filmmaking. In terms of the visual effects, which is to say the kind of more digital effects, I think it looks pretty primitive from today's standpoint, and even from the standpoint of Hollywood cinema in that period. So for example, in part 1, when we see a display of palm power, you know, the bolts of electricity and the magic beams that shoot all over the screen, there's nothing there that hadn't really already been introduced into Hong Kong cinema, I think, by Choi Hark more than a decade earlier in the film Zoo Warriors from the Magic Mountain. Chinese Odyssey films come out just before Hong Kong filmmakers start to aggressively pursue Hollywood-style digital technology. and to try to master it. So I think by the late 1990s there were attempts by directors like Benny Chan and Teddy Chen, Choi Hark again, to assimilate CGI technology into Hong Kong movies with mixed success. And I would argue that it's actually Stephen Chow who is the one who masters the CGI technology in a Hong Kong context, first in Shaolin Soccer and then in Kung Fu Hustle and CJ7. And he did so in a way, I don't think he gets enough credit for this, by the way, and he did so in a way that made even Hollywood executives and Western audiences sit up and take notice and go, okay, I've never really seen anything like this before. This is a fresh brew, you know. Yes, we've had films like The Mask in Hollywood, and we've had films that have attempted to, approximate a comic book aesthetic or a cartoon aesthetic. Who Framed Roger Rabbit, or Dick Tracy, Batman and Robin, but nothing quite like this. It's easy to forget, I think, just how innovative and fresh the film seemed to Western audiences when they were released in the early 2000s. And I think a large part of it has to do with Stephen Chow's inventive use of CGI technology. He puts it to great imaginative use in a way that really hadn't been done before, and in a way that suggested new possibilities for this relatively new technology to be absorbed into comedic storytelling in Hong Kong.
蜘蛛啊！蜘蛛啊！蜘蛛啊！蜘蛛啊！蜘蛛有咩咁架勢啫？好大隻㗎！有幾大隻啊？
Around 2008, I believe, Stephen Chow had an opportunity to work in Hollywood and helm and star in a version of the Green Hornet, which was obviously a character that was associated with his idol, Bruce Lee, in the 1960s television show. And he went to Hollywood and he worked with Hollywood executives, and Seth Rogen, I believe, was attached to the film at the time. And Chow was going to play the Bruce Lee role, Kato. And, it didn't work out, and Chow ended up returning to Asia. Ultimately didn't really return to Hong Kong, actually. Has worked in mainland China ever since. But it didn't work out in Hollywood, and the press releases tend to sanitize these things when they put out the statements. It's a parting of ways, and the creative differences, I believe, was the official reason for Chow departing the project. I think it probably had to do with, it could have had to do with banal things like language difference and language difficulty. Working, I think more substantively, a couple of other things. Working within the Hollywood production system, which I've indicated is very different from the Hollywood working methods. I think I would presume that he would find the Hollywood mode of production sort of stifling creatively. And also, he has a reputation pretty early on, actually, as being a kind of, I think the word is demiurgic director, kind of an all-controlling filmmaker, kind of tyrannical filmmaker. He likes the control. And he wouldn't have had that in Hollywood, where he has to answer to not only producers, but to focus groups and memos from executives. A lot of it interference in the creative process, and I can't imagine him sitting still for that. In 2008, he directs CJ7, and that's the last time that he was on screen as an actor in an extended capacity. So it's clear, even in Kung Fu Hustle, he's on screen less than we might expect as the main sort of marquee star. So it's clear that he's starting to recede from the public eye and retreat behind the camera, that his real interest lies in directing. And he ultimately, some of the films he makes after CJ7 are Hong Kong China co-production, so he's still keeping a foot in Hong Kong, in the Hong Kong film industry. But a film like The Mermaid is a mainland film, and he sets up base in Beijing, a production house in Beijing. He's beloved by mainland audiences. There is, of course, a huge mainland market which can't be overlooked, which is a big enticement for Hong Kong filmmakers. So he's not alone. A lot of filmmakers from Hong Kong have, in the 2000s, moved to China and set up permanent base there. I think there's something like 1.4 billion people in mainland China, so that's a lucrative and vast market to be tapped. He's beloved, as I said, by mainland audiences. He has, for someone who likes visual effects and CGI technology and likes to be an innovator and a modernizer, the budgets are important to him. I'm not sure he could work or would want to work on a Hong Kong budget anymore. He can work. He's one of the major directors in China. He's got a lot of power there, and he can make whatever he likes. He can work at his own pace. Can choose his own projects, and he can work with the biggest budgets. So he can let his imagination fly. Some critics say that they lament his move to China because they feel like he's sold out, and turned his back on Hong Kong and the loyal Hong Kong audience that sustained him through the 90s. And you can see their point of view, I think. But I don't think he's abandoned his Hong Kong style. In terms of his visual gag structures, the way he structures his jokes, very, very much akin to the way he was, constructing jokes in his 90s Hong Kong films. I think he still has a local sensibility, even though he's working in the mainland. And his most recent film, New King of Comedy, is basically an updating and an upgrading of his 1999 hit film, King of Comedy. He doesn't star in this new version, but there's a lot of callbacks to that film. And I think he's nostalgic for his work in the Hong Kong film industry. And I think you can see it's still the same filmmaker, even though he's working with mainly mainland stars and with bigger budgets and mainland locations. I think he's still fundamentally the same filmmaker, the same comedic sensibility that he always was.